Hello everybody, what's up? You're listening to I Was Just Wondering with me, Tom Salmon, the show that dives into music, film and games, and everything else in between. My guest on this week's episode is Will Jordan, the author of the very popular Ryan Drake series and the creator and presenter of the Critical Drinker YouTube channel. We jumped into Will's experience starting out on YouTube as an independent content creator, reviewing video games and films, how he literally found his critical voice, and his love for the iconic horror survival video game series Resident Evil. So if you're running, stuck in a traffic jam, or sitting behind a desk at work, hope you enjoy my interview with Will. So when I discovered your channel, The Critical Drinker, I was excited by a critical voice that wasn't just singly focused on film, TV and video games. You pretty much reviewed them all. Was that a conscious choice on your part?
Most of the time I talk about things that I'm passionate about. One thing I won't do is do a video about a movie or a TV show or whatever just because I think it'll get clicks or views. Like, I don't really care that much about that kind of thing. I do it more just because I talk about the things I'm interested in. So if I've played a particular video game and I want to talk about it, I'll make a video. Same with TV shows that I've watched, and the same thing with movies. So yeah, it wasn't really like I was trying to net the biggest audience I could get or anything like that. It was more just, I guess I've got a broad range of interests when it comes to entertainment. I would even do book reviews, really, if I got round to it, but it's just finding the time, I guess.
I just wondered, in terms of sort of like general sort of criticism, do you think it's the future now that critics sort of coming up now are going to have to maybe consider writing reviews about film, TV and video games really to have a more informed opinion of what's culturally going on? Because I think one of my examples is like Mark Kermode. Like, he doesn't really engage with video games yet. A fair amount of the sort of mainstream films he's watching are inspired by that.
Yeah, I mean, I think if you've got someone like him who's obviously, a fair bit older, he's perhaps not going to have that background in video games that I think is kind of necessary to review them. It's not to say that he couldn't do it. I just think you kind of have to have been part of that industry or that culture for quite a while to appreciate them and to have played a lot of games, so you've got a good point of comparison. So I think maybe these more established movie and TV show critics, they would perhaps struggle to do that kind of thing. And I think, there's definitely commonalities between video games and movies, that sort of thing. Ultimately, most games are telling some kind of story. It's just the nature of it is a lot more interactive, and usually you can influence it a lot more. So it's games are definitely, for me, the harder thing to review, because there's so much more to them than you would get within just a movie, which is a passive experience. But it's all a good challenge, It's something I enjoy doing.
I mean, the one thing I was sort of struck about in terms of video games is there's definitely like a real tangible sense of mechanics to it. Like, how does the actual game play? Like, how does the controller sit in your hand, how the buttons been mapped, and how do the actual shooting or walking or interactive mechanics work, and how does that actually inform the storytelling? Whereas, like, in terms of film, I guess the only thing you really kind of have to consider, I guess, is like sound, so like pacing, in terms of sort of more technical sort of aspects of, I guess, cinematography. I mean, maybe I'm brushing over that a bit too easily, but there definitely is an element to video games where it's a lot more tactile in a way.
Yeah, definitely. That's why they're hard to review, because you're doing all the things that you would look at with a movie, Whereas with a movie, you'd look at the CGI or the cinematography. With a video game, you'll talk about the graphics, but it's the same idea. You've got all the storytelling elements, you've got the characterization, you've got the plot, dialogue, all those sort of things you can talk about. But then, like you say, you have to talk about the mechanics of the gameplay. How well does it function? How well does the game deliver that story to you? What degree of control do you have over it? Just how well does how balanced is the gameplay? All of those things. So yeah, it results in a much broader review, I think, which can sometimes be quite a challenging thing to do. But yeah, I mean, I genuinely, I think I'm one of those people that's kind of ranks video games up there now with movies in terms of like the actual quality of the stories they can tell. They've come on so far in the last 10, 15 years from what they started off quite an industry that was in its infancy to where it's at now. It's remarkable. But with that comes all the expectations that get put on them. The need to be like socially responsible, to reflect all these different things that people look for nowadays, and to try and please critics who kind of a lot of the time just care about activism rather than actual quality gameplay. So they've got their own challenges within that industry.
And that's something I kind of wanted to jump into with you, because you've been very sort of vocal about the modern state of film criticism, especially in 2019. To me, it seems that most mainstream critics have kind of lost their way in the mire of identity politics, virtue signalling, and clickbait to stay relevant. I mean, what's your particular take about just being a film critic in 2019?
Yeah, I mean, it is something I've talked a great deal about, and it's just a pain in the arse, really, because for me, politics is kind of the death of art.
Mm-hmm.
You've got to have creative freedom to tell the kind of story that you want to tell. And if you're now being told, well, you've got to give all of these different groups proper representation, you've got to treat characters in a certain way based on their gender or their sexuality or whatever it might be, it's like starting a game of chess when you're already in checkmate. Like, you've completely crippled your ability to tell an interesting story because you're trying to work within this framework of all these different rules to try and please not just the critics, but all the people on social media who will absolutely pillory you if they think that your movie is stepped out of line. And I think it's to the detriment of entertainment. The result is you get movies now which are just really safe and predictable, and they adhere to a formula because they're so terrified of getting criticism for all this kind of stuff.
Yeah.
And it's that sort of thing's reflected in the critics as well. And I don't know how many of them actually feel this way, and how many of them they feel like they ought to say these things to appease their audience. But either way, they're not looking at the things that are actually relevant. And that's why when you've got people like myself who are just making YouTube videos about it, this isn't our career, or for me anyway, it's not my career. I'm not dependent upon it, and I'm not worried about pleasing people necessarily. So it gives me a bit of freedom to just kind of say what I want to say and call out movies that I think are just crap, basically. So that's what I do, and I take great pleasure in doing it.
Just one of the things as I was sort of preparing for the interview, something that sort of cropped up was the Joker movie, that the victims of the Aurora shooting, which was in 2012, which was related to Dark Knight Rises, this new film directed by Todd Phillips and starring Joaquin Phoenix about the Joker, which they're saying, well, I haven't seen the movie so I don't know, but they're saying it's a little bit more sympathetic take, and there's some similarities between it. So I clicked on the article and I read it, and the first thing you read is one of the victims says this is a slap in the face to the people that were shot there. And then as I was sort of trucking through, the point was that they didn't want to cancel the movie. It was like they wanted Warner Brothers to stop giving political donations to candidates that supported gun control. And I was like, well, that seems like a fair enough sort of like point, but it was definitely wrapped around somebody's agenda of, oh, Joker movie bad, but it even sort of misrepresented the people's the victims' sort of like letter of it, which I thought was such a weird. It was such a weird angle to go at something like that.
Yeah, I think you can't have anything but sympathy for victims of a tragedy like that, clearly. But to then have people who are trying to use that kind of suffering for some kind of political aim is awful. Really, it's kind of reprehensible. But then, if you were to follow that kind of logic, then films like Schindler's List never would have got made, because it's almost like, well, that's going to inspire people to be Nazis or whatever, or anything that deals with unpleasant subjects. It leaves you in a bit of an impossible situation then, because it's almost like saying you can't have movies that deal with any kind of violence or terrorism or any kind of political element of it. So where can you go from there? So I think, again, it's certainly not to downplay things like that shooting, but this new Joker movie is dealing with a comic book character who's been around since long before I was born, and it's a character that people find interesting, and they want to see where he came from, perhaps, and by all accounts, it does a really good job of that. So it would be better to some extent if people were able to separate that kind of art from any kind of political considerations, because it's not what it's meant to represent.
Yeah, I really agree. And what's strange to me is that, sort of like jumping, sort of segueing across, even someone like Robert Downey Jr., I was just thinking about his particular personal history of if he did this, if he behaved or had the similar sort of issues as he did back then. I don't know 10 years later if he'd be cast as Iron Man purely on his own, on his rather colourful personal life, shall we say. And it's the fact that we kind of expect that everybody's going to be sort of like nice, they're not going to have any issues, they're always going to say and do the right things and not have any issues, which I find very weird, because that's the thing that kind of creates character. It's the thing that, you know, struggle and adversity, these are the things that we find most interesting, yet we're kind of cutting ourselves off at the knee by saying, well, only nice people can have and make things, I think, in a way.
Yeah, I think it's that whole element that we have nowadays of like going back into people's pasts, whether it's like digging up a tweet that they made 10 years ago or something like that, and, you know, holding it against them now, or just looking at their past, you know, history. Like you say, those kinds of people, the people who are perhaps a little bit unbalanced or that don't just live regular lives, often turn out to be the ones who are the most creative, who produce the most groundbreaking art or the best performances or whatever it might be. Sometimes it requires that, I don't know, what do they call it, like the kind of tortured artist mentality. Maybe that's what it is, but you know, like you say, there's this expectation now that people need to be like almost flawlessly virtuous all the time and have never put a foot wrong, and the result is perhaps that we're going to lose those actors or those celebrities or those artists who are the most interesting because they're deemed unacceptable. And that's going to be a sad thing, I think, for a lot of us if that's what happens. You know, you see it, I guess, in some movies nowadays where, you know, you might be watching it and you think, God, this lead is just kind of bland, and it's not, he or she's not making any real impression on me. It's because that person's just not very interesting, and it carries over into their performance. Whereas, you know, you get someone like Robert Downey Jr., he's battled his demons, he's had tough times in life, but then it's kind of reflected in who he is now. Yeah, he's a guy who's very much seems like he's been there and done that, and I think that played quite well for someone like Tony Stark.
It did indeed. And I think also, just sort of following on from that point, like art has always been like it's always been a place where like the misfits, the people that didn't really quite fit in, or they couldn't fit in anywhere else, or couldn't quite handle having like a 9-to-5 job, but they had these other sort of like skills that weren't exactly, you couldn't really put them on like a sort of CV, or they weren't anything you could particularly sort of like teach, but this is where they sort of gravitated towards these. And I think by making it more formal, more sort of like neutered, you also cutting off a section of people to sort of exist and actually have like make a career, actually be able to ability to sort of make money in some ways, which seems really, it seems really odd to me.
Yeah, I think there's there's this kind of element now, I suppose, of you know, actors or artists or whatever maybe don't develop as organically as they used to because of, you know, the expectations that are put on them now. Like you say, that, you know, it used to be that you'd get those people who weren't that well adjusted, the misfits who wouldn't be able to do regular jobs like we do, but that's where they shine, you know.
So I just wanted to sort of jump in to the Critical Drinker channel. I was just wondering, when you were starting to think about making YouTube content, did you take inspiration from channels like Red Letter Media, Zero Punctuation? I believe Oliver Harper, I think he started a few years before you did as well. He did sort of retrospectives as well.
I first started doing YouTube years and years ago, just tinkering around with it, mostly because I was interested in video editing and learning a bit more about that. And, you know, it didn't really go very far because I wasn't putting much effort in. And then I eventually left it alone for a good few years and I pursued a writing career instead. That took up most of my time. But I decided to come back to it just out of interest and kind of boredom to some extent. And I was keen to have another go at it, and what I did initially was not so much the Critical Drinker type things, but just a kind of generic, polite sort of you know, YouTuber who was talking about video games for the most part, and it didn't really, you know, not really getting any traction. I was getting like a few hundred hits per video. There's nothing there. But then I almost just put one out with an attitude of like, I don't really give a fuck anymore. I'm just gonna just do whatever I think, and I'm going to say whatever I want to say.
Yeah.
And I did the drinker voice and stuff because I quite like the idea of this character who's kind of articulate and intelligent, but just a drunken asshole at the same time. And for some reason, that video just took off, and before I knew it, it had over 1 million views, and suddenly I had this, this pretty rapidly growing channel, and it felt a little bit like, going on to open mic night with one good joke that landed well, and then suddenly everyone expects a whole set from you, and it's like, oh shit, now I need to do more videos like this. The drinker character, I guess, and the drinker channel didn't come straight away, but then when it arrived, I sort of got immediately why people seemed to appreciate it, and I was like, oh cool, I'm happy to do this because I quite like that character. I like the idea of playing a bit of a character rather than just a boring old voice just analysing stuff. So it just went from there, and it's been great.
In terms of like the critical drink and the voice, because there's something I was sort of interested about, is like this. This guy sounds really, really pissed, yet he's very articulate and has a very forensic approach to criticism that you'd only really get if you were an author like yourself that had spent hours and hours and hours really sort of like dissecting the mechanics of character, narrative and overarching themes. Was actually based on just living in Scotland and just the regular sort of winos you'd sort of run into, or was that something you've been working on for a while?
I think it was, it was definitely based on experiences where you do sometimes find that people become surprisingly like eloquent and philosophical when they're pissed. Before they get over that apex, and then they just become incoherent messes. But you can sometimes get that perfect level of drunkenness, where you're actually really smart and articulate when you weren't. And I really like contrasts in characters and people and stuff. So I love that contrast of being pissed and coming out with really inappropriate humor at times and stuff, but also actually being quite analytical and smart beneath it as best as I can be anyway. And it allows you to get points across really effectively because people listen to you when they're amused and they're entertained. I could do the same things that I do with the drinker, but if I just spoke in a normal way and I didn't crack jokes or anything, people would be falling asleep with it. So having a bit of an entertainment factor and finding something that people enjoy, it allows you to get so much across to them, and people take it in because they're interested in you.
And also I think it's the fact that it's a sort of this character, I want to say, is like impervious to bleach, because there's references to drinking bleach and being fine the next morning, drinking vast quantities of alcohol, so a sort of devil may cry aspect to it, which I guess people like because it's sort of like, there's a bit of a dig, but anybody who works for, say, IndieWire or the more traditional film publications, they are very sort of like clean-cut, on message, almost like politicians, where I guess like he's a complete sort of antithesis of that.
So many of these kind of professional critics and so on, they're so worried about their image or not offending people or whatever that, much like with what we were discussing earlier, they end up becoming completely bland and uninteresting and, doing that thing of like talking for ages but not really saying anything useful. And I wanted to be the complete opposite of that. And I think maybe a lot of us just wish for that, when we're listening to some, boring arsehole at work giving us a PC lecture or whatever. There's that part in all of us, I think, who just wants to go like, oh, fuck off, I'm not interested in what you have to say. But we can't do it. Whereas the drinker gives me an opportunity to just say all these things that perhaps a lot of people are thinking. So that I just really love. It's cathartic.
And it kind of reminds me, because I used to listen to Bret Easton Ellis's podcast back when it was on iTunes and it was free, and he had a very, I want to say, sort of a contrarian view, because he was always talking about empire and post-empire and a lot of sort of identity politics, which I vibed with in a way that I wasn't 100%, I didn't 100% grasp like identity politics, and I still really don't, but there was just certain things that sort of like rankled me. I think the way that's being sort of like positioned, and I'm told that this is supposed to be good for me. I'm supposed to support this because it represents something. And here was someone like Bret Easton Ellis and yourself is kind of saying, well, hang on a minute. No, if you look a bit deeper into this, kind of what they're saying isn't really that much benefit of how they're going about it, because obviously diversity is a great thing, empowering female characters are great things, but I guess it's just how they're kind of going about it for some reason was always sort of like rankling. I wasn't 100% sure why that was, but it's nice someone like you can kind of put that into some context and sort of perspective.
Talking about all of those things, like you say, I've spoken to quite a few content creators on YouTube now as part of my channel, and we all seem to be of like mind in the sense that if you want to have diverse casts, if you want to have strong female characters, whatever it might be, that's perfectly fine. Like, nobody has an issue with that. What we have an issue with is bad writing. And when you take those things, which are noble goals, and you implement it in a really clumsy, awkward, forceful way, you alienate people straight away. And that's why, probably I had an issue with a movie like, say, Captain Marvel, where, you've got theoretically a strong female character who's just completely unlikable because she's like Superman without the kryptonite. Completely invincible, completely unstoppable. Nothing can challenge this character. And she doesn't even have a flawed personality to go with it. She's not wrestling with demons, or she's got some kind of personal obstacle to overcome, something like that, which might have been interesting if she, potentially was a bit of an anti-hero or something. But she's just nice and virtuous and strong and capable and all the rest. And it's so dull. I kind of think that people like characters for their flaws, not their virtues. That's why people can warm to someone like Tony Stark, who's just a selfish asshole to begin with, who's kind of just out for his own glory and not particularly interested in helping people, but then he strives to be something better over the course of his character arc. And that's what people like. Whereas if you've got a character who starts off virtuous and great and selfless, where have you got to go from there? Nowhere. So people don't like it because there's no flaws there to humanize them.
Captain Marvel slowly becomes a bigger and bigger arsehole. And by the end of it,
I was on the podcast when we were talking about this kind of thing, and it's like, God, wouldn't it be interesting if they turned her into a Daenerys from Game of Thrones, and she just goes batshit crazy and starts like incinerating cities and stuff. They have to fight her. She becomes like the next Thanos. It's like, oh, okay, that could actually be interesting. Same with someone like Rey from the new Star Wars movies. Like, if she genuinely turned evil and she became the villain, I'd be like, oh, okay, well, maybe that explains why she's so bloody amazing at everything. It's like they were building up to an evil turn. You wouldn't do that. Obviously, that would involve creativity and imagination.
I, like you, when I went to see the Star Wars The Last Jedi, and the more I kind of think about it, because when I actually watched the film, I guess I wasn't that engaged with sort of Star Wars. I mean, I went to see the Force Awakens. But the more and more I thought about that movie, the more and more I thought, wow, like, I don't know, it's almost beyond words.
How did you get away with it? Yeah. I mean, I've talked about this to various people, and thinking about The Last Jedi is like dealing with a monster from H.P. Lovecraft. Like, the more you think about it, the closer to insanity you get, because it's just mind-boggling, the things that came about to make that movie happen. The fact that he was able to submit a script where the hero of the original trilogy is portrayed as a grumpy, broken, pathetic old man. Where you've got every female character is amazing and competent and flawless, and pretty much every male character is whiny or emotionally unstable or incompetent or idiotic or whatever. A movie that completely breaks the lore of the series and does all kinds of nonsense with like the technology and the science of Star Wars, that nobody would have said, like, mate, this is a great script and all that, but I think there's a few things you're going to have to change here. Otherwise, people are going to have lots of questions about it. It's crazy. I can only assume perhaps that the people at Disney, like Kathleen Kennedy, who was the president of Lucasfilm, brought him in because he would be pliable and easy to kind of control. Whereas you've got other more experienced directors who are probably going to push back on a lot of things. Whereas someone like him is just going to say yes to everything because he's just cutting his teeth as a director. He's really just starting out. Maybe that was the reason. But yeah, like the problems of that movie are more than I could cover in a day of constant ranting about it. It's just insane.
I mean, I was just thinking, I played like a little thought experiment. So I can't think of another actor that played such an iconic character that years later came back, signed up to a movie which essentially was his massive comeback for him. And they just completely destroyed both the actor and the character. And you can visibly see Mark Hamill almost in tears as he's doing the press for this movie, because it was just like a knife to his heart.
Yeah.
The fact they just completely destroyed his legacy in a way and treated him so poorly.
The way I understand it is that he signed up to come back to Star Wars back when George Lucas was still in control of Lucasfilm. Ultimately, Lucas then sold it to Disney, and Mark Hamill kind of went with them as part of that deal. So he'd come back on the basis that he'd been sort of talking to George Lucas with an idea for how his return would work, and I imagine it was a much more heroic Luke Skywalker. So probably he was up for that. And then all of a sudden he gets presented with this monstrosity that he's going to have to do. And I felt so sorry for the guy when he's drinking that green milk. And, it's so humiliating. And I think, honestly, if it had been me, I pretty much would have just refused to do it. I would have honestly just said, look, if you have to sue me for breach of contract on this one, go ahead. I will tell everyone what you're planning to do with this character. And, at this point in my life and career, I don't need this. I'm not that desperate for work that I'm going to put myself through this, because it was just, it was awful. And like you say, there's video footage of him like after the premiere where he just looks like a man who's seen hell. It's dead.
He gets a bad rap, old Mark Hamill, because I was listening to an interview with him in sort of Kevin Smith, and he was like a really legit sort of theatre actor. I think he even went to sort of like Juilliard, so he gets a bad rap for being sort of, he wasn't, okay, so the original Star Wars, he wasn't that good, but he did find his footing, and he's carved a very sort of successful career for himself as a voice actor and stuff. So I think I think it's a little unfair that people don't appreciate just quite how successful Mark Hamill has been in his career as well.
I think so. And, he was very young when he did the original movie, and by the time you got to the third one, he'd grown quite a bit as an actor and a person, and I think he did bring a lot more kind of gravitas to the role than he had originally. So I think he gets a bit of unfair criticism. And the one thing I will say about the guy is, fuck me, he's professional, because as much as he had absolute shite to work with on The Last Jedi, he really gave it his all. Like, he acted the hell out of that part with as much as he could, and it speaks well of his kind of professionalism that even though he knew the nonsense he was involved in, he still cared enough about that character to give it his best. And it's like, well, good on him, I suppose. I just wish he hadn't been forced to do it. Yeah,
me too. Also, I just wanted to just sort of jumping off from that sort of point, I just wanted to sort of jump a little bit into the idea of sort of diversity within the film industry. And what sort of interested me is things like Ghostbusters 2016, Captain Marvel to some extent, and I want to say they're talking about casting female Gandalf for the new Lord of the Rings series. And what was interesting about that is the idea of that through diversity or rebalancing the equation, they're taking established properties which have been male-led, and then they're then taking those parts away from traditional, I guess, like leading men characters, then giving them to women, rather than empowering the next generation of filmmakers, storytellers, and sort of craftspeople to actually create their own stories that are perhaps more reflective and progressive in the times that we kind of live in, which is such an odd, it seems very odd to do in a way.
For me, it's actually unbelievably patronizing to women, I guess, or any minority really that's getting caught up in this, because it's like saying, well, we know you can't make it by yourself and you're not going to be able to come up with good characters of your own, so we're going to give you a character. We'll just take one that was played by a man or a white person or whatever, and we'll give it to you, and it's yours now. It's patronizing to them, because it's like implying that they can't come up with like original, interesting characters of their own. Another example, I guess, would be the James Bond issue where they're talking, the next Bond should be a woman. It's like, well, no, like the character is a male. Like as annoying as that might be for people, like that's what he is. That's the way he was written in the books, and that's the way he's been portrayed in the films. Like, you can't just suddenly decide that a character has gone from male to female without any explanation. And yeah, like a lot of the time it's incompatible with what you're trying to do.
Yeah.
You know, if you were to take Bond and turn him into a female, um, you're not gonna you're not going to be able to play off the same things
Yeah.
that you
Yeah.
do
Yeah.
with the male character. So it's a false equivalency, I guess. So it just most of the time it doesn't work, and it's unfair, I think, to everyone. It's patronizing to the people who get rebalanced into those roles, and
Yeah.
it's really unfair to the people who get roles taken away from them because someone's decided this character needs to be such and such.
Yeah.
So it's not something I support at all. I'm very much in favour of having diverse casts of characters and actors, but let it happen properly. Let you come up with characters who are meant to be that way. I think most people probably have got similar opinions. Not that many people seem to be enthusiastic about these race and gender swaps of characters.
How can ever really truly be diverse if even if you're taking someone from minority, but you're still sort of like ferrying them through this sort of like system, because at the end they're all going to pretty much turn out the same in a way. It doesn't really matter where they sort of started from, but once they go through this sort of like process and they've been sort of like managed, and it just seems they're all heading into this form of, sort of homogenization of fitting this particular mold, which I guess is like it is also an issue as well. As much as they do try and strive for sort of diversity, it's never going to be truly diverse if you keep on ferrying them through this particular, I don't know, system.
Yeah, I think it becomes you're almost trying to engineer something that should happen a little bit more naturally. And it's, yeah, like you say, it ends up coming across as fake. And I think people get a sense of when it's been done. And when you start to see the strings that are being pulled in order to make a movie look a certain way or feel a certain way, it takes you out of the experience. So it results in a movie or a TV show, whatever it might be, that you can't get into because you just see, oh, I can tell why they've done that, or I can tell why they've put this person in here.
Yeah.
It leaches all the fun out of it, really. So yeah, I don't understand how it's meant to work like that.
And speaking of things of that sort of like nature, so I was rather amused to find out that Game of Thrones Season 8 had won the Outstanding Drama Series at the 2019 Emmy Awards. I mean, it kind of made me question, like, do award shows mean anything really outside of selling more movie tickets and boosting ratings for already popular TV shows?
Yeah, again, like Game of Thrones, excuse me, was one of those shows that certainly for me, I was always taken in by it because I always had the feeling of like, this show is smarter than the people watching it. It's got a plan. It's building up to something incredible. There's all these hidden meanings to so much, like, the cycle of the unusual winters and the coming of the White Walkers and all that sort of thing. This all means something, and they're going to explain it, and it's going to be mind blowing. And then you get right down to it, and it's nothing. And then you realize, holy shit, like these guys had nothing going on this whole time. They didn't have a plan.
Yeah.
They didn't know what they were building up to. This show wasn't anywhere near as smart as I thought it was going to be. And again, it's that thing of like, okay, I can totally see the strings being pulled now.
Yeah.
And it's taken right out of the experience. And it's such a shame because it was such a great show when it was at its peak. And it was, yeah, it let a lot of people down, clearly. And I think, going back to your point about the awards that it gets, it's just another example of how, things like the Emmys, the Oscars, all that sort of thing, it is just these people slapping each other on the back. And it's just them self-congratulating and probably doing a good bit of virtue signaling at the same time, rather than any kind of objective analysis of quality and good storytelling. And again, it's probably something that a lot of people are waking up to now because it's so blatant.
Yeah.
When you can see a show that's failed as badly as Game of Thrones getting awards like that, you're just like, yeah, this means nothing now. It really doesn't.
It kind of reminds me of like it being the world's most expensive and biggest office party, and it's rigged, and then all the sort of star performers get out there and have a good old time, and I mean, I should just say, like, so a few years ago, I did go to the BAFTAs. I went to the film BAFTAs, and I had a pretty good time. Like, the pageantry's kind of nice, and I got to speak to the makers of this small indie movie called Lady Macbeth, and to be, I had a pretty good time. But I guess it's difficult because if you really are into sort of like film history and you think of the Oscars or the Emmys and stuff, you're like, well, I wouldn't mind going to that purely for the sort of pageantry. But as for any it sort of being any sort of judgment on the idea of like quality, when's the last time anything has sort of mattered like that? I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, I think up until about 10 years ago, maybe even 5 actually, like the Oscars still meant something. It was to have a movie that was nominated for an Oscar, never mind winning, was an incredible honor for any filmmaker, I guess.
Yeah.
But now, now that they have become so overtly political in the Oscars, and like every bloody person who gets up there has something to say about the Orange Man or whatever, it absolutely kills it. And then you realize it's just people massaging their own egos. That's all it's become. And Hollywood trying to demonstrate how like non-racist and non-sexist it is and how amazing they all are. And that's probably reflected in the fact that viewing figures are now in the toilet.
Yeah.
Less and less people are watching the Oscars every single year because they can kind of see them for what they are. And people don't tune in to watch actors talk about politics. Just because you're famous, just because you're widely known and stuff, doesn't mean you're in any way qualified to have opinions about the current state of world politics. Like, most of the time, you're just as clueless as every other person on the street. You're just better dressed.
Yeah.
And I think that's something that they need to realize because, I think they've lost that sense of reality, I suppose. And things like social media just give them this inflated sense that they are somehow knowledgeable when they're not most of the time.
Sort of just jumping back to Brie Larson, I just wonder if she'll ever look back at about her comments she made about Wrinkle in Time and about white male critics and sort of excluding people from having an opinion on something. I just wonder, if the tides were to sort of like change, I mean, how quickly these people's affiliations or views would sort of like change with sort of like current trends. And I mean, I can't remember a time when it was like where actors could be so divisive in terms of which alliances they kind of had. They always seem to be a bit apolitical, but now I'm thinking of Redford and Marlon Brando.
I think probably because in the past the questions were asked less of them. They were asked less about their political opinions now, whereas in 2019, every single thing you do is political. You pour semi-skimmed milk on your cornflakes in the morning. That's a political act, as far as some people are concerned.
Yeah.
And it's just too much. But then the act of not being political for a lot of people is a choice as well. Like, I think Taylor Swift has consciously stayed away from politics for years because she knew, as much as anyone does, the moment you come down on one side or the other, everyone on the opposite side is going to automatically hate you. And then suddenly you don't make as much money. But then the more you try and resist it, the more people are going to press you on it because, again, they've got this insane need to know what your political views are on everything. And it's just like, you shouldn't subject actors to that kind of thing, and they shouldn't court it because I can't remember who said it, but they basically said, look, actors are pretty much the court jesters of the modern world. They're there to make us laugh and entertain us. Not there to have opinions about things. But they've been forced into that role, and some of them have forced their way into that role, I guess. So I think Brie Larson's probably going to look back on some of those comments she made and really regret them because they come back to bite her so often.
Well, I also think it's like the erosion of sort of star power because I was just making a little mental list of leading male actors that had the sort of star power. I mean, I know it's a different world, but it kind of had the star power of like Tom Cruise that they could open any movie. It didn't matter what the movie was as long as they were in there. And I mean, they tried, I guess, with Taylor Kitsch, I want to say, with like the Battleship movie, John Carter of Mars, Jai Courtney's had a few goes, Zac Efron, but there's nothing's really sort of stuck. So I guess in terms of relevance and where they sit with the culture, the more that you can align yourself with more, in a weird way, it seems like politics is, and that sort of discourse seems more culturally impactful, more relevant, I guess, with the memification of it than movies in some regards, in terms of that being like the focus. I mean, in itself, politics, I mean, has become a sense of sort of entertainment in a way.
now you've got essentially the situation where a reality TV star, who's a kind of entertainer, is now the president of the United States, and the way politics is conducted now, it's it's almost theatrical or pantomime-like in the way politicians insult each other. You know, they don't act like public servants anymore. They act like actors in a play, with the good guys and the bad guys always trying to get one over on each other. And yeah, I guess that's like a weird merging of two worlds. Like you're saying, you know, as entertainment is becoming more political, politics is becoming more like entertainment. They're not really two worlds that should meet. You know what I mean? Like, I would say politics was like really boring, done by people who are really serious about what they do, than what we have at the moment. But that's the world we live in, unfortunately. You know, on my channel, I obviously don't really get into politics in a larger sense. I just talk about the sort of merging of that with entertainment and how it can affect the quality of the products that you're putting out.
So I just kind of wanted to jump into, steering away from politics for a moment. I just wanted to jump into your love for the Resident Evil games, because I watched your retrospective on them. Which I really enjoyed. It was so. The first Resident Evil game that I played was Resident Evil 5. So my appreciation and experience of the series is like very, very different from yours, I guess, from playing the original Resident Evil. And I just wondered, do you think your opinion kind of would have been a bit different if you played Resident Evil 4 first?
I think everyone's got fond memories of their first game in a series or whatever, because that becomes their standard of measure, and that's the way they relate to that series. So yeah, much like for yourself, like you would have played Resident Evil 5. That's a very action oriented game, and that's perhaps how you would view the series. But then you go back to the early ones, and they're much slower paced, and they're much more based around on kind of exploration and resource management, all that sort of thing. But that, I guess, is what kind of appealed to me when I first started playing it. Like I really kicked off with the very first one, like, 20 years ago. Yeah. And I just absolutely loved it. Like I played the shit out of that game, and so most of the other PlayStation era ones, and I found them really enjoyable. And I guess I always wanted to talk about my experiences of playing them and my thoughts on how they gradually change over the years, how the series has gone through different phases. And now it's kind of gone full circle. It's back to Resident Evil 7, which is that slower paced, constrained sort of puzzle solving based experience. So it's gone all the way back to what it started with. And I think Resident Evil Revelations 2 is another one like that. Yeah. Much more constrained, low key, based around the sort of horror aspects of it more. But I've enjoyed all of them in their own ways. Like even 6, which is kind of like seen as a bit of a low point. I can go back to it and play it, and it's like, oh, it's a good action game. It's fun. It's not really a Resident Evil game like I remember, but it's still a good game to play. It's good laugh. Because I just remember playing Resident Evil 5 with my brother on co-op, and we would just play the oh god, I'm trying to remember what it was. Basically, the it's like the multiplayer where you go around and just shoot zombies for points and stuff, and it's timed. Yeah, survival mode kind of thing. Yeah, and we would just fucking play that till we got was it S-Class? I think that's yeah. No, it was good. I liked 5 actually. Like it's in the main campaign mode, I think the 2-player thing felt a little bit tacked on, and when I played it, most of the time I was just doing it in single player mode. Right. So your companion was an AI and not a particularly good one. And I always felt like a Resident Evil game should be a solo kind of experience. Right. It should be you versus the environment, and it makes you feel a lot more vulnerable because you don't have someone watching your back or giving you extra firepower or whatever it might be. But that's just me. That's the way I took it.
I think in the main campaign mode, me and my brother played it, and that you could go around collecting treasure for guns, I think. So it's a case of him, he's a much better video game player than I am, and he's younger than I am as well, so it's doubly insulting. You just go up and run and nick all the treasure.
See, in the original game, I like the fact that you could quite conceivably run out of ammunition. If you play fast and loose with your guns and you try and take out every enemy, you'll just run out of bullets, and then you're screwed. Like there's no more to be found, and then that's it. You pretty much would have to restart the game. So it's pretty unforgiving back then, I think.
But I was just sort of thinking in terms of, because I watched your your Tomb Raider video as well about comparing the two different versions of the 90s version of Lara Croft versus the sort of Ortiz reboot, and which was actually
Yeah.
originally written by Terry Pratchett's daughter, who's quite a well-renowned game writer as well in her own right. And I just wondered, did you have a pitch / treatment for a Tomb Raider film that was tucked away in your desk drawer somewhere?
No, not at all. I was just analysing it purely from the point of view of the gaming experience that you get from playing it. And the thing that always struck with me about the original Lara was that there was a great mystique about the character. I think I talked about that in my video, is that, you only get like little fragments of insight into her life outside of this game and her experiences and stuff, but it's enough to keep you interested in her. And I don't care about what she was doing when she was 8 years old and she was playing hide and seek with her dad in her big mansion house. Like, that's not interesting about the character. It takes away from that air of mystery about her. But I also like the fact that she's much more independent and much better at making decisions in the original game. She's not forced into a situation that she has to kind of escape from, and she's not constantly like crying or frightened every 2 minutes about something while simultaneously mowing down dozens of people. She goes in because she's an adventurer. She willingly goes into these tombs to look for artifacts and stuff because that's what she loves doing. That's her lifestyle. And I think that's incredibly compelling about the character. It's like, oh wow, you've got this female character who's just adventurous, who just loves doing stuff for the hell of it because she finds it fun. I think that makes for a much more interesting character than what you end up with in the new games, where she's always whining, she's always scared, she's always moralizing about how she's to blame for everything. It's less interesting for me, I guess.
Do you think a director like Ben Wheatley and Amy Jump, who've just signed up to do the sequel to the, I guess you want to say soft reboot or the reboot to Tomb Raider that was out a few years ago, I mean, do you think they'll be allowed to take Lara Croft in a different direction? Because my mind was always going, one of the games that she's chasing down T-Rexes, and it gets a lot more sort of mythical, which I guess I'd never really sort of successfully succeeded to get the more fantasy elements of Tomb Raider. They've not really sort of backstepped and tried to make it a bit more based in reality, where I kind of feel that maybe going the opposite direction might be of some benefit to the series in terms of the films.
I think you could go either direction with it. If it's well written, then you could probably make either one work.
Yeah.
The sort of Angelina Jolie movies were based around that more fantastical element. There was magic, there was time travel and stuff in it. And it worked fine for what it was. It was obviously kind of tongue-in-cheek and a bit campy. But I guess that's an element of what made Tomb Raider interesting as a game. It's one of those ones I don't necessarily think it's ever going to translate that well into a movie.
Right.
Like Alicia Vikander, who plays Lara now, she was perfectly adequate in the role, but she kind of felt like she'd taken a back seat in her own movie.
Yeah.
She's just kind of there, and she gets kind of dragged along for most of the plot. Whereas I feel like Lara should be a lot more proactive, and again, it puts her into that situation where she's trapped and she's got to fight her way out of it, rather than willingly going forward and looking for clues and doing the things that are actually involved in tomb raiding. So I'm really surprised they're even doing a second movie, if I'm honest, because it wasn't that much of a success as far as I know. So I don't know how much of an appetite there is for another one, but well, who knows? Maybe they'll do something interesting with it.
So I just wanted to kind of just jump into your own experience of having your own work adapted to the screen, because I know you sold the film rights to your first novel, Redemption, a few years ago. I just wondered how the development process is going so far, and having just watched your video on the adaptation of Clan of the Cave Bear, I just wondered if you had any concerns.
Yeah, I mean, to be honest, when you sign it over, you basically, give up that control over it, and it becomes not yours anymore. It's someone else's interpretation of your work. So, that's fair enough. I think you have to be at peace with that before you even do it. Otherwise, don't sign the rights over. But in terms of the actual process of adapting it to the screen, it's just long. It takes a long time. A lot of people production companies will buy up the rights to a book and then just sit on them for decades because they can. It's just to make sure they've got it, and just in case that book ever becomes like a mega hit, they've got the film rights to it. And in my case, they've been actively developing it for a couple of years. They got a script written. They are trying to pull together this sort of international financing to make it work, because it's not like Universal Studios has bought this or anything. It's a much smaller kind of production company, but it's this movie, if to make it, it's going to need a fairly hefty budget because it's an international thriller. There's action scenes. There's going to be all kinds of location shots they would have to do in the desert, that sort of thing. And that costs money. So the way they have to make it work is to get partners to agree to it, and to invest in the movie, and then get a shooting schedule that allows everyone to get their monies back and all that sort of thing, and get actors attached to it who are going to draw in enough money to make the thing viable. So it's like this huge web or this huge collection of plates that have got to be constantly spinning at the same time, and they've all got to be lined up at that perfect moment to make it all work. So I think they've got quite a few of the plates spinning, so that's good. And for the most part, I'm like, just give me a call when it goes into production, and then write me a check.
So did they? Did you send you like a draft of the sort of script for you to look over, and were they interested in having you give a few notes?
Yeah, I mean, they were interested in my because as far as my contract goes, I've got a degree of creative input. That's what it says. So it pretty much means I can make suggestions, but they can totally ignore them if they don't like them. So most of the time, it'll just be, they'd come to me and say, like, give me a good description of what this character is like. Who do you think would be good to play them? What sort of person do you think they are? And, I'll write them out notes and all that sort of thing. Yeah, and I've seen an earlier draft of the script, which was surprisingly close, actually, to the book. It updated some of the things because the book's set about 10 years ago, so they've updated certain things to make it more relevant. But yeah, most of the things they've actually managed to keep in, so I was quite surprised. Whether that's the final version, I don't know. But it is quite cool to see someone else's interpretation of your work.
I mean, did you not fancy possibly in the future writing screenplays yourself? Because I know it's a very different medium from writing a novel. It definitely is about economy, and it's almost a sense of minimalism on the page. You just don't have, this lovely sort of like flowing sentences and paragraphs and description in screenplays. Is that something that's ever sort of caught your imagination of something you might want to do?
It does appeal to me. Like you say, it's a different process, and you've got to be much more economical. To go from like a 500-page book down to a 90 or 100-page screenplay is no easy task, but to still tell the same sort of kind of story. When I write my books, I kind of imagine the scenes playing out in front of me as if they're a film. So I would imagine the angle I'm seeing it from, and how the characters are moving around in that scene, how they look at each other, their facial expressions, all that kind of thing. So it wouldn't be too far removed from what I do at the moment. And I've had people come to me actually since the YouTube channel's taken off and say, like, we've got screenplays that we're doing for independent movies and stuff. Would you be interested in like reviewing them and polishing them up, that sort of thing? And it's like, well, yeah, I'd love to, but like right now I'm doing my YouTube channel. I'm writing my next novel at the moment. I work a job part-time as well. So all of those things, there's just no way I can fit it all in,
I just was interested, though, in your earliest interviews promoting Redemption, you spoke about character being the key to a successful, engaging story. And I just kind of wanted to know, growing up in Scotland, who was the kind of like most interesting, complex person you knew, and how did they kind of inform and shape your approach to writing fictional characters later in your life?
You meet so many people in your life. There's going to be aspects of people that, whether it's just some interesting little quirk or like a turn of phrase or something about them, you're like, God, that's really cool. I'll work that into a character at some point, or have it form the basis of someone. But it's not like there was Ryan Drake's not based on a real person that I know or anything like that. These characters come from a completely different world, I guess. But yeah, the Critical Drinker is more based on people that I've known growing up in Scotland, because plenty of people like drinking here. So
I mean, what's been the biggest challenge for you transitioning between the literary and YouTube world? And has there been any sort of like backlash from, say, publishers or agents or fans?
Yeah, I mean, I think most people recognise that the critical drinker is a character that you play. You know, it's almost like being an actor; you're playing a role. And you know, for the most part, like I haven't really bothered to try and merge those two different worlds, if you know what I mean. Like I do my writing and I do my YouTube, and you know, I don't see them as overlapping particularly because they're different things. So I guess it's not really been an issue. The more difficult issue is the kind of creative side of it, where you know, I'm writing my books. I have to be in, like, you know, super focused, kind of serious author mode. Yeah. And then if I want to do a script for a drinker video, I have to completely flip into, like, you know, funny, you know, irreverent, but sort of analytical mode to talk about the thing I'm going to do. So it's like a complete step change in my mind. So I have to kind of compartmentalize my brain a little bit to do all these different things.
I mean, can you do both in the same day? Because that's something I found tricky when I've been writing sort of more fictional sort of stuff and then going on and actually writing more analytical stuff. I find for my brain works that I can probably do one a day. But I just wonder with you, do you sometimes write a drinker script and then have like say a few hours spare to, well, not spare, but to write your sort of books as well?
Yeah, I did it yesterday. I was working on my book during the day, and then I decided I was going to do a drinker video in the evening because I was kind of burned out with writing by that point. I was like, you know, need to do something else, and I ended up putting out a video about I think Kevin Feige moving over to Star Wars.
You did? I watched it.
Star Wars movie.
Yeah.
So I did that yesterday evening. So it can be done. It's hard though, and a beer or two kind of helped me on the process to get into drinker mode.
I just wondered in terms of there was sort of an Ozzy Osbourne like sort of like pressure for when you actually meet people in real life to be drunk, to be inebriated and hungover most of the time.
Yeah. I think it's I was you know, it's more of an issue when I'm doing things like live streams or just like interviews like I'm doing now, where you know, I'm not reviewing something and I'm not working from a script. Clearly I can't do the drinker voice for like if I was on a live stream for like 4 or 5 hours straight, I would just shred my vocal cords. Yeah. And you know, you can't maintain that kind of character for that length of time. So I just have to be honest when I do things like that. It's like, look, I'm out of character at the moment. I'm just going to talk as me. But I mean, it's fine because, you know, although the drinker obviously is like me times 100, like all the opinions that I express when I'm doing those videos are my opinions. They're just like amped up a little bit. So I would always stand by everything I say as that character anyway. So when I do talking about movies that I've reviewed in the past or whatever, I'll usually have the same points or the same opinions about them that I've always had, you know? Yeah. So I think it's just managing people's understanding of how it works. And I think most people, you know, they get it. It's like you can't be in character 24/7. That's just not possible.
So my final question for you was, what's your dream project if money and time wasn't an issue?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's kind of happening at the moment. Like seeing my books get made into movies is my sort of ultimate goal. Obviously, one's kind of on the way. What I'd love is for that to be successful and then be able to you know, convert the rest of them into films. To be able to do that, it would be like the kind of biggest achievement, I guess, that I could hope for. So yeah, that would do. I'd be satisfied with that, I would say.
I don't know when you sold the rights, but it definitely seems like there's this golden era of TV, which seems to be maybe not becoming so golden at the moment. But is that something that maybe, because you've got a long running series, I want to say are you on book 8 now of the Ryan Drake series?
Yeah, so 8 of them have come out, and I'm working on the 9th one, which is the last one.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, TV is another option. You could probably do it. You need a pretty hefty budget just because it's action heavy. But that wouldn't be something I would complain about. I think either way, if you bring it to the screen, so few authors get that opportunity. So even to have gotten to the stage that I'm at makes me feel, you know, incredibly lucky. Yeah. So I just kind of happy to see where it goes, I suppose.
So there you have it. I had a great time chatting with Will. Please do like and subscribe to the show on SoundCloud and YouTube, and drop a comment or two. And you can get in touch with me at the Salmoning01 on Instagram. Thank you so much for listening. I've been Tom, and I'll catch up with you next episode.